All right, let's talk about Alan Fisher now. Friend of the show, Alan is a gigantic train nerd, and I think he's going to do a good job describing exactly what happened.
Give it up for today's fighters in the red corner, weighing in at 4,700 population in an underdog Rust Belt town from Ohio. It's East Palestine. And in the blue corner, weighing in at 1 million pounds of vinyl chloride, fighting and dropping cars consistently on the ground on Horseshoe Curve, it's Norfolk Southern. And to officiate today's match, from the Department of Transportation, it's Pete Buttigieg.
In an egregious violation of...
Hooking up the country, helping business run. Helping this big...
Jokes aside, this disaster does suck for those who are affected, both with being relocated, with possible contamination, and with the water supply. But everyone has been extremely lucky that there haven't been any deaths or major injuries from this accident. There's one thing that's certain about this incident is that there has been a stupid amount of news coverage, and anyone who...
The worst part is people at East Palestine still have to pay $5 a month to avoid the top of the hour ad break on this fucking broadcast. You know what I mean? But at least they got $5 from Norfolk Southern, so they can use it that way. But regardless, at the top of the hour, there's still a 3-minute ad break. If you no longer want to see those ads, all you need to do is subscribe, baby. For $5 or for free with the Twitch Prime or by getting gifted a sub. You know it. Here's the 3-minute ad break now.
Who says it's a cover-up is a bit goofy at this point. The reason why it wasn't big news in the first place was because derailments usually do not warrant a lot of news coverage. They happen more than most people think, and they're usually pretty mundane and boring for the average 24-hour cable news viewer. I just think that they weren't expecting this one to really blow up as much as it
He's right about this.
did, so coverage was slow at first. Since it did make it into the major news cycle, there's a lot of interesting and bad coverage from journalists that never talk about trains that suddenly now have to talk about trains. And for people like me who talk about trains...
I mean, I gave you Alan's perspective ahead of time. I told you because he was like tweeting about it a lot. He likes trains a little too much. Obviously, he's going to be very fucking nerdy about it. One thing to keep in mind is like, you know, train derailments in comparison to like where they were is still a lot better. When you think about 1,000 train derailments a year, especially that factors like, you know, silly ones like the train just got off the track a little bit, you know what I mean? All of those are still a part of the train derailment number. And even with everything else, like 1,000 is actually fairly, like incredibly small in comparison to where it used to be. Still terrible in comparison to other countries, obviously. But just, you know, keep things in perspective. America, you know, multiple decades ago was way, way, way worse. Alan praised the USSR for its railroad successes compared to America at the time, so yes, he's based. No, I know. He just loves trains too much.
Trains a lot. It's been a painful process to read through these articles and takes about what happened. So for clarification, let's take a quick breakdown of what happened with this derailment in basically chronological order. On February 2nd, Norfolk Southern Train 32N left the Terminal Railroads Association's Madison Yard just outside of St. Louis. Allegedly, the train crew that departed from the yard with 32N reported hearing unusual noises from a part of the train that would later have issues. The train then made its way through Illinois, Indiana, and finally into Ohio, being on the move for roughly 700 miles. At 8 p.m. on February 3rd, the train was making its way through Salem, Ohio, 20 miles west of East Palestine, Ohio. Here, flames were spotted coming from one of the axles of one of the cars.
And the video on your screen now shows that the train appeared to be on fire. This is interesting. 20 miles before it reached the site where it actually went off the tracks, derailed. Now, the footage on your screen is captured by a security camera at an equipment plant in Salem, Ohio.
At 8:54 p.m., the failing axle finally gave out and caused the train to derail in East Palestine. From this point, there's a lot of politics, mismanagement, and generally bad communication on all fronts, but I'm not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about the train. So was there any way to prevent this? Yes, actually. One of the tools that US railroads use to make engineers aware that something is wrong with their trains are devices called defect detectors.
Detectors, you have all sorts of types of detectors. You got dragging equipment detectors for hot bearings. You have line side detectors that do non-safety stuff like telling where the car is. But the most common ones are hot boxes detectors and dragging equipment detectors. And lines like this Norfolk Southern line, they're about every 20, 30 miles, depends how many curves. The more intense the layout of the track is, more hot box detectors you're going to have.
That's my friend Brian. They go by they, them, and they used to work for a Class 1 railroad in field management for maintenance away. I'll be
Brian's in the chat right now. They tweeted, not tweeted, they wrote in the chat earlier.
referring to them and 2 other friends throughout the rest of this video for when I need someone with a little extra experience or knowledge in these subjects to be referenced to. Anyway, defect detectors are a critical piece of infrastructure for any modern railroad. Like Brian said, these detectors can pick up on hot boxes or whenever an axle or bearing is getting too hot. Hot boxes aren't just for that Corolla sitting in a dorm parking lot. The name originally comes from railroads from when old journal bearings were still in use. Journals used to overheat commonly, and the box where the journals sat in oil would catch on fire or smoke. Eventually, journals were replaced with roller bearings, which were not only more
People say Hasanabi has a jobless. Here you have a Hasanabi head.
efficient, but also more reliable. Roller bearings rarely fail or catch on fire nowadays, but it still will happen if they are not maintained or inspected. It's very confusing how the axle on this Norfolk Southern train got to the point of failure. Defect detectors are scattered all throughout the network. Remember that video of the train car on fire going through Salem, Ohio? Well,
It was supposed to ping multiple times over. So most likely the real issue here is that they basically were like, yeah, fuck off. No, keep it going. Don't stop, because it takes a lot to stop a train and fix it. So they were just like, yeah, just go through. It doesn't matter. Like, especially from what I understand, long trains with a fuckload of cars, like 50 cars, when they have to stop at a train stop, they are even more difficult to maintain. Because like there is bro, a long train like is 300 cars. Okay, what are you working for fucking Norfolk Southern? Why are you saying this? That's what they said. They literally said, bro, it used to be double the size, you fucking dummy. Anyway, 50 isn't long. Got it. Okay, everyone who's a train engineer is yelling at me. Long trains are difficult to fucking process through. They hold up the entire railroad, and of course they hurt profits. So sometimes they just fucking tell you to ignore the signs, ignore the warnings.
actually a defect detector
And yes, they require more workers.
in Salem. So the alarms should have been going off on the radio calling out to the engineers that there's an issue. I don't know why or understand why 32N didn't stop, because it's proper practice to come to a stop when a detector is tripped. But okay, so if the detectors couldn't have been relied on in this situation, could the brakes have stopped the train from derailing? And what if we upgraded them to a newer system? So if we're going to talk about brakes, I first have to teach you all how train air brakes even work. Modern
I love the voice Alan takes here. Like, he's like, oh man, here we go again. It sucks that I have to do this. When it's like, Bitch, we know you're excited to talk about this. Like, he sounds annoyed, but he's not annoyed. This is like extremely his shit. He's like, oh, dude, it's so sick that I get to teach people how braking systems work on fucking trains. You know what I mean?
Air brakes on trains work with a pretty simple concept. Compressed air lines on the train are one single system, so when the pressure drops at the locomotive, the pressure will drop throughout the train, causing the brakes to be applied. When there's a drop in air pressure below the normal, the brakes will start to apply. The signal that applies the brakes is literally the drop in air pressure going from car to car. The signal travels as fast as the speed of sound as the pressure drops from car to car, so even if it isn't instantaneous, it only takes a dozen seconds for all brakes to be applied on a 2-mile-long train. Now, what if we wanted to speed up this brake application? In the news,
For the record, I know Alan got mad at David Sirota for constantly talking about the brake deregulation from the Trump era, or everyone else that's been using that as well. I don't give a fuck, because deregulation is still deregulation. Deregulation and lack of adequate spending on infrastructure is in the same exact vein. It's also the exact same as cost-cutting measures, such as like reducing the number of people working on maintenance. It's also the exact same cost-cutting measure or profit-driving measure, such as the precise systems that they have now, where they're lowering the amount of time that they had for maintenance checks. All of that is exactly the same. Like, they're all the same attitude.
we've been hearing a lot about electro-pneumatic controlled brakes, or ECP brakes. ECP brakes would essentially equip every single car with a computer that would open and close the brakes based on a signal from the engineer. This would allow for the brakes to be applied instantaneously. There are a lot of issues with applying ECP brakes to every car in the country, but I'll talk about that later. One of the current solutions for speeding up brake applications on trains is to place another locomotive.
I think he thinks ECP brakes would make trains less safe overall. I think Alan thinks that. Maybe he doesn't. Because then they'll make the trains even larger. Then they'll add even more carts, just because then they can say, well, we have the ECP brakes, so we can make it even less safe overall, in a way that like other parts of the infrastructure will not be able to hold on to. David Sirota, however, he thinks they wouldn't make a difference in this situation either. Yeah. Also, on top of that, David Sirota recognizes ECP brakes and why they were at the very least like dropped as a ECP brakes were promoted originally as a cost-cutting measure from these companies to say like, look, we have new brakes. Yes, it'll make them less safe because it'll mean you can go coast to coast without an inspection based on the original DOT rule. Yeah, so they were advocating for this originally as a cost-cutting measure for them, like internally, from what I understand, where they were saying like, look, we have these new brakes. When we put these on, there's going to be less regulation necessary for it. We can fucking maybe even, I assume, put more weight on the trains, shit like that. It'll be more safe because no company ever actually makes technological innovations specifically for the sake of making technological innovations or making things more safe. They do it so that they can make more profit, right? So they can drive up profit. So that's precisely what they were advocating for. And then the government was like, oh yeah, that seems great. The ECP brakes seem great. We should make sure that you guys you have to put it into all of the trains that are carrying fuel. Like anything that is flammable or explosive, like should have ECP brakes now. And they were like, whoa, 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 hold the fuck on. We don't want that, actually. Now you're forcing us to put this fucking thing on everything? No shot. And that's the easiest way to describe the saga between Norfolk Southern and other train companies and the lobbyists and the government regulation surrounding it, and why they deregulated it after they said you should put it onto every single train. Now, in this circumstance, it doesn't... Will you stop euphemizing a chemical disaster by calling it derailment? The hyper-specific pedantic Andes are in the chat. We got it, man. You got it. Now you're forcing us thing? No, well, the now you're forcing us means that, like, if they were asking for that, that means that they're going to have to spend a lot of money on all of their fucking trains, even ones that they didn't intend on putting ECP brakes on. So that's why they didn't want to do it. That's why they were advocating against it.
Somewhere in the train consist or at the rear. This remote-controlled locomotive controls air pressure the same way that the lead locomotive does, essentially doubling the speed of the brake application by being another air control point in the train. Multiple people either working in the industry or part of regulatory agencies all agree that the Norfolk Southern train would have still caused a major incident regardless of whether it had normal brakes or ECP brakes. Here's Jennifer Homendi, an NTSB chair member, responding to questions about brakes and the derailment. Her main point is that if the suggested rules for ECP were even in effect, this train wouldn't even have been affected by the mandate for this consist. Even then, once you derail a car, no matter the braking system you have, you're going to have an issue. So here's my friend Alex, a 5-year engineer on a Western Class 1 railroad, and his opinions on the subject.
And what happened with the Palestine derailment when they say the train went into emergency, I can't say this without having been there myself, of course, but from what I've seen of the bearing on fire and just the accident, I'm betting that the bearing melted off the axle point, the car went on the ground, and as soon as that hose breaks off from the rest of it, it will put the whole train into emergency. Where it broke, we'll send it both directions for emergency braking. However long that may have taken, I can't remember how much or how long 32 Nacho was, but I believe it was somewhere around 800 feet, according to a friend who had it. So that would have taken maybe 3 to 4 seconds going each way to reaching the train. Not long. ECP wouldn't have done anything within that given time frame to do it, especially if the car is on fire.
So if brakes aren't the thing to go after, then what should we be advocating for so something like this doesn't happen again? But before we go on to policy, let's close out this section with some words from my friend Justin Rosniak.
I sort of feel like we're going through this rigmarole again, where it's like, well, we could do basic maintenance and slight upgrades to existing systems, but instead, we're going to go way ahead and say, use this new thing that no one's ever used before.
So I don't want to make this section too long because policy is always a bit difficult to listen to. But sometimes when people are talking about Pete Buttigieg online and how he can't really do much, they're sort of right. You see, under the DOT, there is an agency called the Federal Railroad Administration. And unlike the airplane version, which is the Federal Aviation Administration, the FRA is very underfunded and doesn't have as much power over the industry that it oversees as the FAA does over its industry. There are 2 reasons for this, and one is easier to fix than the other. The first is that the FAA controls a lot of publicly owned airports and can easily deny companies the right to use those airports, where the FRA has to deal with private companies and private infrastructure mainly. And
it's literally because it's longer. It's been around for longer in our dog shit fucking country, and therefore they have more time to have eviscerated any kind of nationalization efforts. That's it. And the more private the ownership is, the the less the amount of hands that hold it. That's it. It's really fucked up, but it is precisely the reason. I mean, railroads historically, and even the building of railroads historically has been fraught with monopolists and the awful fucking capitalist barons. You already know that. The main issue, and this is like Alan is absolutely correct, and I'm sure he'll mention this now, is that it's not nationalized. The government has limited regulatory power because, they don't even want to do the subsidy part of the regulation. They don't even want to do the fucking bully pulpit part of at least like advocating for certain things and wagging the fucking finger. But when all else is considered here, you still have you don't have the actual power to stop railroads completely. Stop these 4 fucking railroad companies from completely dominating.
And so it's harder to oversee all of that. What we should take away from this is that the FRA has a lot less oversight over the industry because it's private. And then the other thing the FRA can do is we can just give it more money, because part of the problem with the FRA is that they don't have enough money to hire enough inspectors to actually go out and check all of our infrastructure regularly, and all the cars and rolling stock and all that too, of course. Next thing to fix is labor. The first thing you should do is you should make it a law that you should have 2-man crews. 2-man crews is not only safe, but has subverted some disasters that were going to be worse than the Norfolk Southern derailment. The BNSF Castleton derailment was going to be insanely worse if it wasn't for 2-man crews. Part of the train was broken apart after it caught on fire after derailing and taken away from the rest of the train so that the other...
I think another part of this is also that like the airlines, or at least people that work on airlines, have stronger unions maybe than the railroad union, I feel like. I might be wrong about this, but that's like the last remaining fucking point of defense against this kind of ridiculous. That's the last remaining point of defense against this kind of ridiculous, like, profit-seeking attitude. Especially because they're trying to do this for airplanes too. Like, they're currently, remember, we talked about this. Yeah, Reagan gutted the unions, but the remaining unions are still stronger, I think. And what I mean by that is, as it stands currently, American Airlines are trying to do the exact same thing that they're talking about with 1 pilot planes. They don't want to have 2 pilots anymore as a cost-cutting measure, which is an insane thing to advocate for. But our unions have been pushing back on it aggressively.
Ethanol cars would not catch on fire. There are other obvious labor policies that you can enact, like forcing the railroads to actually hire enough people to do inspections and keep good schedules instead of forcing people to work way overtime or way too many days in a row. Other than labor, another piece of legislation that's probably needed is a standardization of defect detectors. Defect detectors do not have standards, and they are actually different for each railroad. They just happen to be similar because companies make them similar when they buy them. And lastly is PSR, or Precision Scheduled Railroading. The problem with PSR is that it makes trains double or triple the length that they used to be, and this compounds a lot of problems that already exist, including the fact that if you have a problematic car, it's hard to dig out of the train if there's an issue with it in the first place. So, if you want some rules and policies to fix the industry, here they are. Here's 5 good ones right here. I do like that public ownership idea. That might come back around, or I have a few other videos that might mention that concept. But I don't know. Norfolk Southern is a pretty terrible railroad, and I'm not saying that Conrail was perfect, but I'm just saying that they never put a train on the ground because of a hot-boxed car. and so it's harder to oversee all of that. What we should take away from this is that the FRA has a lot less oversight over the industry because it's private. And then the other thing the FRA can do is we can just give it more money, because part of the problem with the FRA is that they don't have enough money to hire enough inspectors to actually go out and check all of our infrastructure regularly, and all the cars and rolling stock and all that too, of course. Next thing to fix is labor. The first thing you should do is you should make it a law that you should have two-man crews. Two-man crews is not only safe, but has subverted some disasters that were going to be worse than the Norfolk Southern derailment. The BNSF Castleton derailment was going to be insanely worse if it wasn't for two-man crews. Part of the train was broken apart after it caught on fire after derailing and taken away from the rest of the train so that the other
I think another part of this is also that, like, the airlines, or at least people that work on airlines, have stronger unions maybe than the railroad union, I feel like. I might be wrong about this, but that's like the last remaining fucking point of defense against this kind of ridiculous, that's the last remaining point of defense against this kind of ridiculous, like, profit-seeking attitude. Especially because they're trying to do this for airplanes too. Like, they're currently, remember, we talked about this. Yeah, Reagan gutted the unions, but the remaining unions are still stronger, I think. And what I mean by that is, as it stands currently, American Airlines are trying to do the exact same thing that they're talking about with one pilot planes. They don't want to have two pilots anymore as a cost-cutting measure, which is an insane thing to advocate for. But our unions will have been pushing back on it aggressively.
Ethanol cars would not catch on fire. There are other obvious labor policies that you can enact, like forcing the railroads to actually hire enough people to do inspections and keep good schedules instead of forcing people to work way overtime or way too many days in a row. Other than labor, another piece of legislation that's probably needed is a standardization of defect detectors. Defect detectors do not have standards, and they are actually different for each railroad. They just happen to be similar because companies make them similar when they buy them. And lastly is PSR, or Precision Scheduled Railroading. The problem with PSR is that it makes trains double or triple the length that they used to be, and this compounds a lot of problems that already exist, including the fact that if you have a problematic car, it's hard to dig out of the train if there's an issue with it in the first place. So, if you want some rules and policies to fix the industry, here they are. Here's 5 good ones right here. I do like that public ownership idea. That might come back around, or I have a few other videos that might mention that concept. But I don't know. Norfolk Southern is a pretty terrible railroad, and I'm not saying that Conrail was perfect, but I'm just saying that they never put a train on the ground because of a hot-boxed car.